In this video, we're going to learn about the exchange of materials between blood and tissues, and also about the function of lymph vessels. So we need to know about the exchange of materials between tissue fluid and cells through pressure filtration. We need to be able to describe the role of lymphatic vessels, describe the components of tissue fluid, plasma and lymph, and be able to compare the composition of those fluids and see how they differ. Right. If you think back to National 5, you should know about some of the different components of blood. We have plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. White blood cells are involved in the body's immune system, and platelets are involved in forming blood clots when a blood vessel is damaged. Red blood cells are involved in the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and plasma is the pale yellow liquid part of the blood. The main component of it is water, but it has all sorts of other substances dissolved in it, such as glucose, carbon dioxide, amino acids, various other nutrients, and proteins are carried around by the plasma. Because plasma is the liquid part that has lots of materials dissolved in it, it has got a very important role to play in the exchange of materials between the blood and body tissue cells. As blood arrives at the capillary bed, the arterial end of the capillary bed, the blood is at high pressure. That high pressure forces the plasma out of the blood by a process we call pressure filtration. So this pressure filtration causes plasma to pass through the gaps between the endothelial cells in the capillary walls, and that bathes the cells in the tissues. We then call the fluid tissue fluid. So when it's in the blood, it's called plasma. When it's surrounding the cells, it's called tissue fluid. So this liquid that's squeezed out of the capillaries is now called tissue fluid. It's similar to plasma, however, the main difference is it lacks plasma proteins, because the plasma proteins are too big to fit through the tiny gaps between the endothelial cells lining the capillary. All of your tissue cells are near a capillary, and your tissue cells are constantly bathed in tissue fluid. So you can see from the diagram, we have the blood vessel, the capillary, which has plasma in it. Surrounding the capillary are the tissue cells, and the tissue cells are always completely surrounded by tissue fluid. That's the name for the plasma that has been forced out of the blood capillary by pressure filtration. Okay. So this diagram shows a capillary bed with associated tissues and also lymphatic vessels. Blood comes in through the arteriole. The high pressure forces the plasma out of the blood and into the tissues. And when the fluid surrounds cells, it is referred to as tissue fluid. As we move through the capillary end towards the venule, some of the tissue fluid is able to diffuse back into the capillary. But because we now have low pressure, there's not enough pressure to force all of the tissue fluid back in. So the remaining tissue fluid passes into the lymphatic vessel. The tissue fluid that surrounds cells ensures that the cells are supplied with glucose and oxygen, because the glucose and oxygen simply diffuse into the cells. Carbon dioxide and other metabolic waste diffuse out of the cells and into the tissue fluid. So most of the tissue fluid returns to the blood at the venule end. Okay. Water moves in by osmosis, and carbon dioxide and other waste products will move in by diffusion. Any excess tissue fluid that is not absorbed passes into the lymphatic vessels and they return it as lymph to the circulatory system. Okay. So, once the fluid passes into the lymphatic vessels, it is now known as lymph. So, in the blood, the fluid is called plasma. When it's surrounding the cells, it's called tissue fluid. And when it's in the lymphatic vessels, it's called lymph. The small lymph vessels eventually join up together to form larger ones, and the lymph is returned to the circulatory system. Like veins, lymphatic vessels have valves to prevent the lymph from flowing backwards. It's also associated with lymph nodes, which have got a role to play in your immune system. The main ducts that return the lymph to the circulation are just underneath the collarbone. They are called the lymph ducts. And this helps to drain excess fluid away from the tissues and prevent fluid from building up at your tissues, causing swelling or oedema. This table shows a summary of the different types of fluid and what they contain. So take a minute and pause. You could copy it down, complete it, and then restart the video and see if you're correct. Plasma is found in the blood vessels. It contains red blood cells and protein and glucose and oxygen, and at the arterial end, the pressure is high. Tissue fluid is found surrounding the body cells. It does not contain red blood cells or proteins because they are both too large to fit out the very tiny gaps between the endothelial cells lining the capillary. It contains glucose and oxygen at the arterial end. The pressure in tissue fluid is low. Lymph is found in the lymphatic system. It does not contain red blood cells, proteins or glucose and oxygen, and the pressure in lymph is low. Now, you're not required to know this. However, if tissue fluid gathers in the spaces between the cells and is not removed from the tissues effectively, it will build up and it will cause swelling called oedema. And you can see it here quite clearly. Sometimes if there is an injury, you get oedema, or if there is a problem with circulation, you can get oedema. Okay, so lymphedema is swelling as a result of damage to the lymphatic system. And kwashiorkor is caused by a lack of protein in the diet. Tissue fluid is not returned to the blood, and it causes swelling of the abdomen. And elephantiasis is caused by parasitic worms which block the lymphatic system.